Welcome to another episode of Jews in the World. I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, and my guest today, calling in from Israel, is Shalom Lamb. He is the co-founder and chief historian of Operation Benjamin. And what is Operation Benjamin? Well, he's going to tell you. But when I came across this a few weeks ago, I was just astounded by this amazing mission. So take it away.
That's great. Thank you, Phyllis, for having me. And let me dive right in. Operation Benjamin is something that most people don't know. We're a solution to a problem that most people don't know exists. And so let me just back up the bus a little bit. Most people are unaware that hundreds of Jewish soldiers, American GIs during World War II, who fought and died for America, were buried in overseas cemeteries, America's most iconic cemeteries, Normandy American Cemetery, and those beautiful, magnificent, hallowed places, but were buried mistakenly under Latin crosses, and there are hundreds of them. And so our mission is to work hand in hand with the United States government, with the American Battle Monuments Commission, with whom we have an extraordinary relationship, and with the families of the fallen, and correct those by replacing the Latin cross with a Star of David when we have sufficiently proved that that is warranted. And sufficiently proved are the operating words. It's a very, very tough thing to do. We agree that it should be a tough thing to do. Doesn't make our job any easier, but it's appropriately a tough thing to do. These are very, very serious things.
Okay, now he's the chief historian, but I'm going to explain this something. I got out for this interview my husband's dog tags from when he was a U.S. Army officer in the early 70s. And it says very clearly here, Jewish, the last, okay, I don't expect you to see it on this. I want Shalom to explain why many of the soldiers buried in World War II that could have been a mistake and not purposely buried under, he calls it a Latin cross, I just call it a cross, and rather than a star. So explain that about dog tags in World War II.
So let's back up the bus once again. It's a funny thing, a funny historical fact that Jews in the Civil War were not called Jews and weren't called Hebrews. They were called Israelites. It's kind of a nifty name. I'd like to go back to that. I like it.
Yes,
and then in World War, it's kind of neat. Then in World War II, it was an H for Hebrew on your dog tag, and now you're Jewish. But in the old days, in World War II and World War I, it was an H for Hebrew. And many soldiers took the logical step of saying, if I'm going to be captured in Europe by Germans, and the Japanese at that point were unknown, I don't want to be identified as Jewish. And therefore, many, many, many Jews put a P on their dog tag for Protestant, or C for Catholic, or they had the option of putting nothing at all. And so those were the options. And you can only imagine the United States government Graves Registration Services saw a P or a C on a dog tag and didn't question it. It made logical sense. 97% of those who fought were 97% of the country, were some form of Christianity. And it was logical that they would bury these guys under crosses rather than Stars of David. So there's no malice here. It's just mistakes, innocent errors. Sometimes it's clerical errors where a guy did have an H on his dog tag. But soldiers in the European theater were typically buried 3, 4, 5 times. In the Pacific theater, they were buried up to 7 times. And
take 1 minute to explain.
Sure. So a guy would be killed in battle, right? Tragically killed in battle, and be buried by his buddies in a shallow grave, put a rifle on the ground, put a helmet on, put a dog tag on. And the Graves registration would follow, and they would take this, they would disinter the soldier and bring him to a collection area where he would be buried again. And then they would ultimately create a small regional cemetery and bury him again. And ultimately the national cemeteries all over France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and Manila in the Philippines, and they would be taken to that final permanent burial place. But think about it. 5,000 US soldiers were killed every month of the war in an age before computers.
And we're talking about World War II.
World War II. We're talking about here about World War II. And so the ability to make a clerical error, a simple, unintentional clerical error was very, very high. Now, in the Pacific, it was worse because you were dealing with so many islands and so many in these transports. So people would be buried again and again and again, and these mistakes would crop up, even if a guy had an H on his dog tag. But more typically, we find guys were buried under a cross because of what they had on their dog tag, and the parents at home didn't understand the form, were too distraught to fill it in properly. You know, on the form they would say cross or SOD. Well, what's an SOD? Well, it's a Star of David.
Oh,
But most people who are immigrants wouldn't even know to check off that box. And then the logical next question is, well, didn't they go and visit after the war and see? And the answer is no. And a number of things happened. First of all, the world was huge in those days. Today, the world is very small. I want to go to the United States. I live in Israel. I want to go to the United States. Order a ticket online. I go to the airport. It's electronically scanned. Boom, 10 hours later or 11 hours later, I'm in New York. But then it was a matter of going to war-torn France, where there was no economy, war-torn Germany, war-torn Belgium. All these economies were crushed, were destroyed. Why
and they
would you
didn't
go
speak,
there?
wait, I'm just going to, and they didn't speak English the way.
The way they do today. And nobody had Google Translate. And a lot of these people were first generation Americans who didn't have many resources and had many kids at home. And so they would sadly have this kid buried overseas and never did visit. That's a much later thing. The people visited in the 1980s, the 1990s. That's when people did visit. And by then, most people figured there was nothing they could do about it when they found a mistake. And that was often the case. So kind of sad, very sad.
So how did Operation Benjamin start? Give us that story.
Operation Benjamin started by accident. All good things start by accident. This was an accident. One of my co-founders, I have two co-founders, Rabbi Jacob J. Schachter of Yeshiva University and Stephen Lamar, a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And what happened was Rabbi Schachter was leading a tour of the Normandy region for scholars of medieval Jewish history. But it was around the time of D-Day, so he said, hey, let's go and visit the Normandy American Cemetery. And for very
Wait,
good reason.
what year was this?
This was 2014.
Okay, keep going.
Okay. And Rabbi Schachter was particularly attuned to this because his father was a very famous World War II chaplain, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who was amongst the liberators of Buchenwald with the U.S. Army. And that totally affected his life. He affected many people's lives in turn, in a very heartwarming story. But Rabbi Schachter grew up with World War II soldiers basically all around him. And that was a very major content of their home. So he was very attuned to this. He went to the cemetery and said to himself, this is gorgeous. I thought there would have been more Stars of David. So I saw him about 3 weeks later. I'm a military historian by training, and we know each other for a very, very long time. And he said to me, Shalom, I just visited Normandy. It is hallowed ground. It's holy. It's magnificent. It's dignified. I just thought there would have been more Stars of David. I don't know why it resonated with me very powerfully. I knew just as a historian, 2.7% of US casualties were Jewish. How many soldiers are buried in Normandy? I had no idea. Looked it up. There are 9,380 or so. So just the math, real quickly, this should have been about 240 Jews, Stars of David in Normandy. There were 149. Where did the Jews go? And that was the operating question. So we kicked this question around for a long time, coming up with these crazy theories that you do when you have no idea what you're talking about. But slowly but surely, we began to circle around some real ideas. There was a Rabbi Akiva Males, who's now in Memphis, Tennessee, who wrote an article, a very interesting article, about his father's dog tag. And that was the first real hint we have that, hey, maybe we're looking at something very interesting here. So we decided to go really scientific, basically took a dartboard and said, okay, let's find a guy with a Jewish sounding name who's buried under a cross. And that guy was Benjamin Garodetsky. And now we're Operation Benjamin. And I didn't know anything about genealogy then. Why would I? So I spoke to a guy I knew named Steve Lamar. Now, Steve Lamar have become very close because his daughter and my son got married. And I spoke to Steve, was a good amateur genealogist. And I said, Steve, why don't you help us discover about Benjamin Garodetsky? And he did. He did a wonderful job. Turns out that Benjamin Garodetsky's family was from Zhytomyr in Ukraine. He came over when he was 6. And wouldn't you know it, I lived on Long Island at the time with my wife and family. And his parents were buried 10 minutes from our house. Who'd have thunk? And so we went to the cemetery in Elmont, New York, on a really hot date. And we went all through the cemetery. We found his family, and it's a completely Jewish cemetery. What's Benjamin Garodetsky doing under a cross? And we began to investigate. And turns out he had a P for Protestant on his dog tag. He was a combat medic with the 66th Armor Division for 3 years, and was killed in a Luftwaffe bombing in combat. And so we called the American Battle Monuments Commission. We said, hey, we think we found a mistake. We assumed we had discovered the cure to cancer. And it wasn't a great phone call. It really wasn't a great phone call. Postscript, we have a spectacular relationship with the ABMC now. They understand us, we understand them. We work together hand in glove. But the first call wasn't so great. Subsequent calls, when we sent them our research, were really good. They were very, very helpful. And they basically said two things. You need to prove with contemporaneous documentation. You need to prove that this soldier was Jewish. So now we go back 3 generations with contemporaneous research. We do a very thorough job. And we prove the soldier was Jewish. That's number one. But number two, we had no standing. We are not allowed to request a headstone replacement. It has to be the closest living relative. So when we do our research, we not only have to go back 3 generations, we now go forward generations. And that takes a lot of research. We build these massive family trees. So by the time we contact a family, we know so much about them. In most cases, not all, but most cases, we know much more about their families than they do. And so we've had the pleasure, really the honor, of introducing families to each other that they didn't know the other branch existed. And we actually just did that very recently. And so it's tremendously satisfying work. And then you get the family on board, and then you petition the United States government. We now do that regularly. And then when they approve that, if they approve that, we then have a very, very beautiful ceremony where the headstone is formally changed. Then it's really spectacular.
You just had one, right? Which is what I read about.
We actually did one that was actually the first one for us, the thing, where we didn't change the headstone. We actually found a missing soldier. And we buried him 2 weeks ago at the Normandy American Cemetery. When I say we, it was the American Battle Monuments Commission, ourselves, the family. It was an extraordinary thing. This soldier landed on Utah Beach on D-Day as a D-Day soldier.
Wait, let's remind people, June 6th, right, 1944?
June 6, 1944, we just celebrated the 80th anniversary. And then 17 days later in the Battle of Cherbourg, Cherbourg was an incredibly important battle for the United States, for the Allies. He was killed on June 23rd, 1944. He was first shot in an ambush. He was a lieutenant, a second lieutenant during the war. Posthumously he became a first lieutenant. And his name was Nathan Baskin. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was shot, taken prisoner by the Germans, ended up dying that afternoon in a German Luftwaffe hospital, was buried in a mass grave first in Cherbourg, then moved to Normandy, France.
Wait, we need to say it's buried in a German.
German, oh yes, buried in a German mass grave.
Yeah.
And we found him in a German mass grave in a place called Marigny. And then the question was, so first of all, how do you prove he's there? And then how do you rescue him, basically? It was an amazing saga of about 18 months. And I think it's really important to sort of stop and take cognizance of something really important. We were successful. The chances are, having been successful, were absolutely minuscule. I will tell you, the hand of God, just every time we came up on something that said, now it's going to fail, something happened where it worked. Ultimately, it was perfect DNA evidence that proved that he was who he was and where he was. But the heroes of the story, I really want to make this really clear, were the German government. The head of the German War Graves Commission, the Israeli ambassador from Germany, was an extraordinary help. The French were very helpful, the Americans were very helpful, but the Germans were the key to it. And they rose to the occasion in a way that is absolutely spectacular. And we live in a different world. We live in a very different world. He died in 1944, was buried with people who wanted to kill him. And we dealt with people who stopped at nothing to make sure he got repatriated to his family and to his people and to his country. 80 years is pretty amazing.
And so where is he buried now?
He's now buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. There are very, very, very few burials there since World War II. You have to have been a soldier appropriately to be buried there. It was amazing. It was a completely full military honors burial and a completely Jewish burial. That has never happened before. And it was a great honor.
You mean never happened before in the Normandy Cemetery?
It has never happened before in any American military cemetery that I'm aware of. foreign military cemetery. Because, well, first of all, during the war, when all these burials happened, or shortly after the war, they were not public. So I can assure you that all the Jewish law and traditions were not followed. And that's, I cast no aspersions there. This was after the war, talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So certainly, no criticism whatsoever. But here we had a circumstance where we had an ability to plan it. We knew in advance this was happening. It was not wartime. The cooperation by the American Battle Monuments Commission was off the charts extraordinary. They were very, very sensitive to our needs of Jewish law and Jewish tradition needs. And we were very, very, very sensitive, as we always are, to the military aspects and the military needs. And we were able to combine them and synthesize those in a way that was simply spectacular.
And I just want to say this for people who have never been to Normandy. So when my husband and I were stationed in Munich, we went in 1972 in April. So there were, in those days, were not a lot of tourists. We were the only ones. I will never forget standing at Point du Hoc, looking down and knowing that they knew they would die and they got off those boats. And it's just for Americans who don't understand what Jewish and non-Jewish soldiers did. It's an incredible experience. I highly recommend it. If you go to Paris, yes. I said to my husband, no, I don't want to give up 2 days in Paris. He said, we're going. And he was right. I'm giving a plug to go. And also, I didn't realize until years ago how, and this is interesting. Okay, we were stationed in Munich before the internet. Okay, we looked for Jewish places in Western Europe. We had security clearances. We couldn't go to Eastern Europe. But what we didn't know was amazing. But there are American military cemeteries all over Western Europe. And again, I highly recommend that tourists go there and pay their respects.
They're amazing. I will tell you, 2 headstones that we replaced, just to put a fine point to what you're saying, were 2 brothers, the Solomon brothers, Frank and Charles Solomon. Charles was a sergeant. He was a tail gunner of a B-26, if I remember correctly. He's buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. And his brother was a pilot of a heavy bomber, and he was also killed. And he's buried at the in Belgium at the Ardennes American Cemetery. And we changed those headstones one day after the other. The younger brother, Charles, was killed first at the end of 1943. And I will tell you just the statistics are that an air crew in the late 1943 had a virtual 0 chance of surviving 25 missions. And
the
still
number
he
of
went.
missions again? The number of missions?
25. Yeah, 25 missions.
25. Okay.
And that means you take off, you do a bombing run, whatever you do, you land, that's a mission.
Right.
And they had literally virtually a 0 statistical chance of surviving 25 missions, and yet they went. Certainly everybody felt fear. It's crazy to think not, but they went knowing the risks and knowing they were doing something much larger than themselves. Frank Solomon knew that his brother was killed at the end of 43. We know that because he wrote letters home to his mother, very, very moving letters about it. And yet on that February, 2 months after his brother was killed, he got into the left seat of that cockpit of his Lancaster heavy bomber, and he took off for a mission, and he was killed on that mission. The bravery is just astounding. And you stand there and you cannot believe you are standing amongst such heroes. It is a Jew and Gentile, makes no difference. It's absolutely magnificent. It's a great honor.
Exactly. So I wish that when we had known about these cemeteries when we were there, because we were in Normandy and never went to visit the museum. So the cemetery. We went to visit the museum that's there.
Right.
Yeah.
There are many now. There are many museums down there.
Yeah, in 72.
Very high quality. Yeah, probably
it was
not.
only one.
Yeah.
But so I highly recommend that we honor these people and that we understand. I don't talk politics, but that we understand the part that Jews and non-Jews have played in democracy for the United States.
It's very important. You won't get me to talk about politics either, but I will say that one of the problems I think that plagues society is that because it's a volunteer army, most people in America don't know anybody who is serving.
Yes.
The disconnect between the population and the military is vast. And as a result, most people don't get that freedom isn't free, and that we're just, as Ronald Reagan said, we're just one heartbeat away paraphrasing, one heartbeat away from losing it. And the people who do serve know it acutely, but they are a tiny, tiny, tiny part of the population. I think it's a big social problem.
I would very much agree. When my husband was, he was an ROTC at Michigan State, which is where we met. Yes, it was just the time when they were changing to the volunteer army. And with the work that I've done, and I think I will include in the description here, my site, Operation Support Jews in the Military.com, and I also have one in support of our troops.com. That fact is not talked about enough. That in a volunteer, with a volunteer army, the percent of Americans today who have any contact with someone in the military is so slim that they really, really, the majority of Americans, again, I'm talking in, don't understand what our troops go through, and that it's very important that we support them in all ways.
It is, absolutely.
So I'm just thrilled with what you're doing. Let's talk tactless now is the way. Okay, didn't grow up in English speaking. People donate to your organization, but if you just told me, which is so important, you don't allow. So if a family comes to you, they can come to you now and say, we think that our relative was buried, blah, blah, blah. We want to know. You'll tell us how that works. You don't take money from them.
We don't. We have a very strong prohibition that we've established on ourselves that we don't take money from the descendants of these soldiers. And it's important for us because when we contact a family, you can only imagine the first thought is scam, right?
Yes,
And
exactly.
so I make the point that we don't ask for money. We won't allow you to donate, certainly for years. And so it's very, very important that we maintain that level of purity. So as a result, we survive. We can only do our mission by the public's goodwill, and people are very, very wonderful and generous. And our website is operationbenjamin.org. And the reason I'm saying that is it's a very robust site. We have videos of virtually every single ceremony we've done. We will be posting from this last soldier who we buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. We will have multiple videos in the next few weeks up that are simply extraordinary and will make anybody proud as a Jew, as an American, as a person who loves democracy and freedom. You can't help but sit there and go, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then when you realize the number of federal agencies, the number of good people who had to come together in order to rescue this Pittsburgh kid, it is really quite amazing. People really pull together in magnificent ways.
So tell us how a family, anyone hearing this podcast say, I think that I'd like to know whether a great uncle, however many generations, was buried under a cross or Star of David. What happens? What do they do?
Sure. They go to our website and we have a way to contact us, and people do all the time. And they say, hey, I knew my uncle. I only know his first name. I only have part of his serial number. We get these all the time. And we're usually able to help out and say where he's buried. For many families, this is new news. For other families, we sadly have to tell them that that soldier is and has been missing in action for 80 years. We unfortunately have to deliver that news from time to time. And then there are other times where we say, that's amazing. We can help you. And we have done that. I remember the case particularly of Lieutenant Kenny Robinson at the Ardennes. His half sister was a wonderful, great, terrific woman, came to us and said, I know my brother, my half brother, is buried under a cross. He's Jewish, and we've been trying to get this changed for years. Can you help us? And we got it done in 6 months, and it was really fantastic. I will tell you that in the beginning, our first headstone replacement took us over 2 years to get done. The Solomon brothers, who I spoke about, took us, I'm talking about after the research is completed. The Solomon brothers took us well over a year. But now we know the ABMC, they trust us, they know the quality of our work. And now on average, once we submit our research to the ABMC, the approval comes in about 60 days. So it's we've come a long way.
I want to know though, did the American Army keep records of what someone was buried under? So can you quickly find out if you have the name and the serial number without having to go to the Ardennes Cemetery? Did you know whether this person, I mean, let's say the half sister didn't know and she said, was he buried under a cross or a Star of David? is that listed again, it could be a clerical error, but did they even, I don't want to say bother, but did they even note that information at the time?
So the answer is yes, but you have to get that information. First, you have to get that information. It's called an IDPF. It's an individual deceased personnel file. That's not an easy thing to get. We now have access to these, but they're not so easy to get. It's a process. That's A. B, the IDPF sometimes is wrong. And that's, of course, a problem. And only some of America's cemeteries are photographed online. Some of them are not. So if somebody calls us and asks us from a relatively smaller cemetery, Epinal in France or Rhône in northern France, you know, you can't find that online. So what we will do is we will send out a photographer and find that grave and photograph it. Or we'll call the superintendent. We now have wonderful relationships with these great, fantastic people. And we'll ask them to photograph it for us. And, 100% of the time, they'll be happy to do it for us. So we find this all the time. By the way, I wanted to say something really important. This is really critical. Many times a researcher will call us up and say, hey, I found a soldier. He's Jewish. He's buried under a cross. I just want to let you know that so you can do what you do. And I would say 95% of the time, we will do the research and the soldier is appropriately buried under a cross. And we'll write back to the researcher and not say, oh, darn, we missed one. It's just the opposite. I am delighted to tell you that this soldier is honorably buried appropriately under a cross, and that's a good and comforting thing. So those are important things to know. So it's not just we want to find the Jewish guys. No, we want to give honor and truth to these guys. And if it's a cross and it's supposed to be a cross, man, that's great.
I want to go back to something that we discussed at the very beginning. Was there only Jews who put blank on their dog tags, or were there other people that put blank on their dog tags?
Anybody could. If it was only Jews who did that, that would be a problem because there's a blank, then you have a Jew. So
that's what I was.
There may have been plenty of reasons why people would do that. For instance, just being an atheist. That's one answer. But there were not lots of options today. If you get buried in a Veterans Administration cemetery, I think there are 38 flavors that you can claim. But in World War II, it was cross or star. Those were the choices.
Interesting. So what else? Well, I'd like to know. You were an historian before. What was your specialty before that you were called on to this mission?
So I was actually a businessman most of my life, and that was good and had a good run. But I always had a very, very, very deep interest in the American military. So with a career going and 5 kids and lots going on in life, my very talented, very dear wife encouraged me to go for a master's degree in military history, which I did. And I got that in 2001. Had nothing to do with career. I never thought I would use it in reality. It was just a deep and passionate interest. And that was in my specialty. My major was in Civil War history. So my specialty is Civil War history. And I've written on it. I've been on a bunch of videos about it as an on-air historian. But when this opportunity came up and it just piqued my interest, I retired and said, this is interesting. So I like to joke that I've never made so little money in my life, but been so happy. So, so it's really great.
So is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners? I hope that this podcast is shared widely, because I really think that your mission is very important, both for the family and the military personnel, but also for Americans to understand that Jews served in the military and continue to serve in the military today, in the American military today. Yes, there are Americans who serve in the Israeli military, but there are Americans who serve in the American military.
They sure do. They proudly serve. My own nephew was a Marine for many years, is now in the Air Force. And they proudly serve, and we're proud of them. I would like to add something. There is a religious theological basis for what we do. And it's important to know that. I'd like to tell you a quick biblical story, and I think it's going to drive it home. If the defining historical event that defines us as Jewish people was the Exodus. We talk about it all the time. It's Passover, and basically every holiday in one way or another refers to the Exodus. And if you're an Orthodox Jew, you're praying 3 times, and it's 3 times a day. It's in your prayers, and you recall the Exodus. Why the Exodus? Because we went down as 12 brothers. We left as 12 tribes, and then a few days afterwards are Mount Sinai, and we become a nation. It's the defining event of Jewish history. So if you look at the Torah, you look at the Bible, you look at the verses, there are 10 plagues and Moses and Pharaoh and the arguments back and forth. And this story is building, and it's very dramatic. It's a wonderful story. And then the craziest thing happens right at the Exodus. Instead of going, and now God sends them out, boom, Torah stops dead in his tracks. And if you look at Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, the whole story stops dead in its tracks. Like the worst thing that Hollywood could do. It stops. And it says, and Moses went to get the bones of Joseph. Get the bones of Joseph. There are 3 million people about to leave. There's a staff of 3 people, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. I got more people who run Operation Benjamin. You know, how 3 people, you think they were busy? There were a few 100,000 children who needed diapers. I mean, the management headache alone must have been extraordinary. Why is it stopping to get the bones of Joseph? He's been dead for 210 years. Who cares? And the answer is that is the lesson. At the height, the most important moment in Jewish history, Moses said, we do not forget our heroes. And he stopped the action, collected the bones of Joseph, fulfilled a promise, and brought him out with Egypt. And that's what we hope to do. These soldiers fought for us. They gave up all of their tomorrows for us. And then they lost their ability to fight for their own identity. We pick up that flag and we bring it home for them. And that's what we do.
Well, it was a very moving story, a biblical story, which is especially appreciated. And I hope that it moves people to encourage and be part of your mission, because I think it is a wonderful, wonderful mission. And I
Thank you
think
so much, Phyllis. I appreciate it.
And it made me think that the hostages need to come home, that we don't leave people behind.
Absolutely. Never. It's not in our DNA.
And may all the veterans' memories be a blessing.
Amen.